Diane Whitfield needed nothing that night except a ride home. Her company sedan died in the middle of a mountain rainstorm, and the only man who stopped was me, a widowed father in an old SUV. She looked at my truck the way people look at a junkyard. For 45 miles, she made small, careful cuts at my job, my truck, my ordinary life. Then a fallen branch made me brake hard. A stuffed rabbit rolled out from under the back seat. Diane went white. She had seen that red thread in its ear before. She had sewn it herself. If you like stories where arrogance finally pays its bill, subscribe now and stay with me, because the next turn cuts deeper than the first. The test facility sits alone in the Colorado mountains, 11 miles past the last gas station. Whitfield Aerospace had just closed a private evaluation on a new airframe, the kind of program a company builds its next 20 years around, and the whole facility carried that particular smell of ozone and machine coolant that always follows a long run. Outside, the weather had turned from bad to worse in about 40 minutes. The helicopter meant to lift Diane Whitfield off that ridge sat tied down on the pad, blades sagging under the rain, and nobody in a flight suit was going to argue with a ceiling that low. The company sedan came up the access road to collect her, a long black machine with $112,000 of engineering under the hood, and it made it exactly as far as the second gate before something in its electrical system quietly gave out. Diane stood under the overhang with her arms folded, her coat still perfectly dry, her phone at her ear, and every line of her body said this delay was a personal insult arranged by someone who would be found and dealt with. She had a board meeting at 9 the next morning in a building 4 hours south, and that meeting would decide whether the program she'd staked her reputation on moved into production. I was loading my own truck when Robert Keene found me. Robert was chairman of the board, standing out in the rain looking for a ride. My truck is an SUV from the 90s with 260,000 miles on it, a hairline crack in the windshield, and a maintenance log I keep in a notebook in the glove box because I do the work myself. I was wearing a work coat, jeans, and boots with a fresh streak of gear oil across the left toe because that afternoon I'd gone down into the test cell personally to put my hands on a component cluster that data had made me curious about. Robert looked at me, then at the sedan, then at Diane, and made the arrangement in one sentence. I was driving right past her neighborhood, and I could take her home. Diane came across the wet pavement with an assistant holding an umbrella over her and stopped 6 feet short of my truck, looking at it the way a surgeon looks at an infection. She didn't ask my name. She didn't ask what I did there. She asked whether the thing was strong enough to make it 40 miles, and there was no humor anywhere in the question. I told her it had never once left me stranded. She got in the way a person gets into a vehicle beneath their station, tucking her coat close so it wouldn't touch anything. I closed the door for her because my wife raised me better than the situation deserved. Here's what she didn't know as I pulled out through the gate. I knew exactly who she was. I'd known her face for 11 years from photographs my wife kept in a shoebox and looked at maybe twice a year, always late, always alone at the kitchen table, always putting them back without a word. I said none of it, and I understood with a strange calm that I was now sitting less than a yard from the woman who had cut my wife out of her life like a name off a list. The rain got heavier around the 4th mile, the kind that turns headlights into 2 smeared cones and makes 40 miles an hour feel reckless. A closed vehicle is a confessional, and it's also an arena, and Diane treated it like the second one. Somewhere around the 10th mile, her eyes started cataloging the inside of my truck, and I felt the conversation shift gears before she opened her mouth. She found the small insulated lunchbox on the floor behind my seat and a child's fleece jacket folded on the bench with a hair tie sitting on top of it. She asked if I had kids. I told her I had a daughter. That was the whole answer. I didn't offer a name, an age, or a photograph, because a man learns quickly which parts of his life are safe to put on a table. She asked where the mother was. When I said nothing at all, she took my silence as an answer she already approved of, and her voice softened into something worse than contempt. Sympathy aimed slightly to the left of a person. She told me it was admirable what men like me did, managing what we could with what we had. Then she started explaining me to myself. She said I assumed I'd chosen contract work for the flexibility, since a man in my circumstances could hardly compete for positions demanding real hours and real travel. She said the industry was full of capable hands who plateaued because they never learned to think above the level of the part in front of them. When I told her my work was on the engineering side, she gave a small laugh with no warmth in it anywhere, and said good technicians often mistake fixing machinery for understanding how to run a company. I kept my eyes on the road. I let her keep going because in my experience, people tell you the truth about themselves fastest when nobody interrupts them. She talked about scale, a favorite subject of people who confuse it with importance. She managed 11,000 employees across 4 states. She'd approved decisions worth $240 million in a single afternoon. She said all of this to a stranger in a work coat as though reading me a citation. Then, because I'm not made of stone, I asked her one question. Did she believe the system we'd tested that week was actually ready? The temperature in the cab dropped 10 degrees. She didn't answer the question. She answered the fact that a man in a work coat had asked it. She told me a person in my position looks at one bolt, and a person in her position has to look at an entire company. She said it slowly, spacing the words, the way you speak to a child who's interrupted adults. I told her that sometimes one bolt is the thing that stops the entire company. She laughed at that, a short, dismissive breath through her nose, and turned to look out the window at nothing. Remember both of those sentences, because in about 14 hours, one of them was going to be repeated in a room with 12 people in it, and it wasn't going to be mine. 2 miles from her gate, she opened her purse, took out 3 folded bills, set them on my dashboard by the vent, and said the word gas, the way you tip a valet you'll never see again. I picked them up and handed them back without slowing down. She held them for a second, and I watched something recalculate behind her eyes as she decided what she'd just seen was the pride of a poor man, a thing she knew how to correct. She said I shouldn't turn my pride into an expense my child would end up paying. That sentence went
into me like a splinter, and I didn't answer it for 4 or 5 seconds. I've never once found raising my voice useful. I took the bills back, reached over, and slid them into the outer pocket of her coat, saying nothing while I did it. The silence after that was the first silence in 40 minutes she hadn't filled. She stared straight ahead, jaw set. The road narrowed where the pines lean in close before the turn toward the old estates, the pavement dark and slicked and littered from the wind. And I saw the branch about half a second before my headlights found the whole length of it lying across my lane. I braked hard and steady, and behind me something slid out from under the back seat, hit the console, and dropped into the space between our feet. It was a rabbit, cream-colored, worn down at the paws to the gray of an old dish towel, its body gone soft and lopsided from 30 years of being held. One ear had a seam running across it, closed with red thread, 6 uneven stitches, the kind of repair made by someone who owned a sewing kit but not the patience for it. Its left eye was a dark green button, a shade too small for the socket, sitting slightly higher than the right. Diane bent forward to pick it up out of pure reflex, the way anyone would, and her hand stopped 4 inches above it and simply stayed there. She didn't move for a long time. I knew what she was seeing. 25 years earlier, a family dog had gotten a hold of that rabbit and torn the ear nearly off. There was no matching thread in the house that night, and a girl was crying. So Diane Whitfield had sat down on the floor of a hallway with a red spool from a ham repair and put the ear back together herself. She'd replaced the missing eye a week later with a button off one of her own blouses, dark green, slightly too small, and never bothered to fix the height. There is no second rabbit in the world with that ear, that thread, that button. Diane knew it before her hand came down. She whispered a name, Claire. Just that, barely loud enough to carry over the rain. I felt my hands tighten on the wheel without deciding to tighten them. She turned in her seat and actually looked at me for the first time in 43 miles, and her voice came out without any of the armor it had carried all night. She asked where I'd gotten it. I didn't answer immediately, because I was doing the arithmetic on what the next 4 minutes were going to cost both of us, and my silence lit a fuse. Panic in a person like Diane doesn't stay panic, it converts. She began building a case out loud at speed. Maybe I'd bought it at an estate sale, maybe it came out of a storage unit. Then she reached the accusation she really wanted. Had I ever had contact with her daughter? There was something in the way she said the word daughter that told me she hadn't spoken it aloud in a very long time. I found a gravel turnout past the branch, pulled off the road, and put the truck in park. The rain came down on the roof like gravel poured from a height. I turned in my seat so she could see my face and said it as plainly as I know how. Claire gave it to my daughter. Diane didn't move. Her hand was still half raised, still in the air above the rabbit, and I watched her try to fit that sentence into a shape she could carry. She asked where I had her daughter's belongings, asked it like a prosecutor. So I closed the distance for her. I told her that Maya is also Claire's daughter.
The quiet that followed had a texture to it. Rain, the engine ticking down, the blinker I'd forgotten to cancel. Diane's eyes went across my face, down to the rabbit, back up, and she said nothing at all. I told her Claire was my wife. Then I sat there and let her be the first person in that vehicle to breathe. She didn't believe me. That wasn't stubbornness, not entirely. It was the only structural support she had left. She knew there'd been a man once, years ago, a man she'd decided was beneath her family, without ever agreeing to be in a room with him. She'd never learned my name. She'd made a point of never learning it, because a name makes a person real, and she'd needed me to stay a category. She ended the argument the way she ended all arguments, by telling her only daughter that if she walked out of the Whitfield house to go be with that man, she shouldn't plan on coming back. Claire walked. She walked out with 2 suitcases and a shoebox and that rabbit, and married me 9 weeks later in front of a clerk in a small town hall, 2 strangers as witnesses. She wore a plain dress she bought off a rack for $60 because she said she was done wearing things that came with conditions. Diane, sitting in my truck 25 miles from that town hall, told me what she'd believed at the time, that Claire would be back inside 4 months, that hardship was a teacher working on her behalf. Claire never came back, and Diane never went looking. When I asked why, she said the only honest thing she said all night. Going to look would have meant admitting she'd been wrong. So I told her the last part. I told her Claire had died 2 years earlier, in the spring, after being sick for a while. I didn't describe the illness or the room. Diane's mouth opened slightly, and no sound came out. I said the 3 sentences I'd carried up that mountain without ever expecting to deliver them. You did not know she was married. You did not know she had a child, and you did not know she was gone. Diane looked down at the rabbit on the floor of my truck,
at the red thread her own hands had put there when she was younger than I am now, and I watched a woman who managed 11,000 people discover she had no procedure for this. Then I put the truck back in gear because we were still 9 minutes from her gate, and there was nothing left to say that would survive being rushed. Just before the turn, because she'd earned the whole truth and not a comfortable slice of it, I told her Claire had tried to tell her all of it herself more than once. The Whitfield estate has a stone gate and gravel drive that curves so you can't see the house from the road. I stopped at the gate rather than pulling up to the door, and Diane didn't get out. She sat there with the engine running and asked me for proof, and I respected her for that more than she expected, because a woman being handed a grandchild by a stranger in a rainstorm should ask for proof. I took out my phone and found one photograph and turned the screen toward her. Claire in that $60 dress on the steps of the town hall, squinting, laughing at something off frame, her hand flat against my chest. That's all I showed her, nothing of Maya, not one frame, because my daughter wasn't going to be evidence in a hallway argument she hadn't agreed to join.
Diane looked at that photograph for a long time. Then instinct came back up through the grief like a hand out of water, and she started asking the wrong questions. What had Claire left behind? What was I looking for? How much? Why had I surfaced now, this particular month, with the company's largest program in history sitting one vote from production? Was I planning to use a 7-year-old girl to open a claim on the Whitfield estate? That was the first moment all night my face actually went cold, and she saw it happen. I told her Claire never took another dollar from anything with the Whitfield name on it after the day she left. Not a check, not a tuition payment, not a wedding gift. And that she was proud of it in a quiet way that had nothing to do with spite. I told her I had no interest in her estate and less interest in her name. Diane, who couldn't help herself, gave me a thin smile and said everyone needs money. The only difference between people is the number. So I gave her the sentence I'd been holding for 11 years without knowing it. That is exactly why Claire never came home. She got out. I waited until the gate closed behind her, then drove the last 12 minutes to a house with one porch light on. I carried a sleeping child up a flight of stairs and put a stuffed rabbit in the crook of her arm, then sat on the floor of the hallway for a while in the dark. What happened inside that stone house I learned later, in pieces, some from Diane herself, some from a woman who'd run that household for 26 years. Diane walked into 11,000 square feet of paid-for silence, and for the first time in her adult life felt no power in it at all. She stood in the front hall with her coat still on and rain still in her hair, and asked the housekeeper whether any letters had ever come from her daughter. The housekeeper didn't have to check. She'd been waiting 8 years to be asked that question and answered it by repeating an instruction Diane herself had issued in a single line, standing in that same hall the winter after Claire left. All personal correspondence from Claire goes directly to archive. It does not go on the desk. Diane had said it once in about 4 seconds, in the middle of being furious, and then forgotten it completely, the way powerful people forget the small orders other people spend years obeying. The staff hadn't forgotten. A single instruction spoken in anger had run without interruption for 8 years. They brought up a file box from the lower level, gray, unremarkable, with an inventory sticker on the lid. Inside were letters standing on edge in date order because someone cared enough to keep them that way. The first year, the envelope said, "Mom." The second year, one said, "Mom, please read this." After that, the handwriting on the front changed into something formal and careful and terrible, and every envelope for the next 6 years was addressed to Diane Whitfield, the way you'd address a company. Diane sat down on the floor of her own study in a suit that cost more than my truck and opened the top one. Claire had written that she was married, plainly, happily, hoping one day her mother would want to know the man in the enclosed photograph.
The photograph was still in the envelope. The second letter, 4 months later, said she was pregnant. Diane didn't open the third. She sat on that floor with 2 pages in her hands, looked at the postmark on the second envelope, and did the arithmetic every one of us can do without wanting to. It came out to nearly 8 years. At the bottom of the box, on top of the last envelope, the handwriting was thinner, slower, wrong, dated less than a year before her daughter died.
She was at headquarters by 7 the next morning. I know, because I was there at 6:40, and her car was already in the executive level of the garage. The woman who came out of the elevator on the 11th floor hadn't slept. You wouldn't have known it from a distance, the suit, flawless charcoal, the hair exact, and she moved through that lobby the way weather moves through a valley. 3 people changed direction to avoid her. She walked into the boardroom at 8:59 and sat at the head of the table as though the previous evening had happened to somebody else. The meeting had one purpose: whether the new airframe went into production tooling, the point in any program where money stops being a plan and becomes a factory. Diane wanted approval that morning and had her arguments lined up. She wasn't wrong about the stakes. A 6-month delay on a program that size costs a number with 8 digits and relationships with 3 governments. Robert Keene let her finish. Then he said the independent reliability assessment was complete and the assessor was going to present it in person, and asked the assistant at the door to bring him in. The door opened and I walked in. No work coat, no streak of gear oil, no jeans, and no expensive suit either. I've never found a good suit makes a bad finding easier to swallow. A pressed shirt, a plain navy blazer, a folder, a laptop with a cracked corner. Diane's hand stopped halfway to her water glass and stayed there. I took the empty seat at the far end of the table, directly across 19 feet of polished walnut from her, and said good morning to the room, the way you say it when you have work to do. Robert made the introduction, and I watched it land on her one clause at a time. Dr. Ethan Marsh, independent specialist in reliability engineering, retained directly by the board 6 months earlier, reporting to the board, not the executive team. Diane's eyes went to the folder in front of me, then to the header on the summary sheet at every place setting, and I could see her finding it in her memory, because the name on all that correspondence had been abbreviated E. Marsh. It had crossed her desk perhaps 40 times in half a year, in scheduling notes and access approvals, and one billing summary she'd personally initialed, and she'd never once been curious enough about the person behind those 5 letters to ask what he looked like. Here's what she learned about me in the next 90 seconds, in front of 12 people. That I wasn't a maintenance technician, that I'd spent 14 years consulting on flight-critical systems for programs considerably larger than hers, including 2 she'd competed against and lost, that an analysis framework I'd built in my 30s was currently used by 4 manufacturers on 3 continents to model how small failures propagate into large ones, and that the board had specifically requested me for one reason, stated aloud by Robert. I had a documented history of not bending my findings when a chief executive leaned on me. Diane isn't slow, and she isn't a coward. She counterattacked inside 10 seconds, informing the board that the assessor had a personal relationship with the chief executive's family, that this constituted an obvious conflict of interest, and that any finding in that folder was therefore compromised. It was the right move. In most rooms, it would have worked. Rebecca Sloan, the board's counsel, didn't even look up. She slid a single document into the middle of the table and let it sit there. It was my disclosure, signed and dated 11 days before I ever signed the engagement. In it, I'd declared the whole of it in writing.
that I had been married to Claire Whitfield, formerly an engineer at this company, that she was the chief executive's daughter, that she had died 2 years earlier, and that we had a child, that I held intellectual property jointly developed with her. The board had reviewed all of it, obtained an outside opinion, imposed reporting terms routing every draft of my work through counsel rather than the executive suite, and then hired me anyway, on purpose, with their eyes open. There was one more line, and Rebecca read it aloud in the same tone she'd have used for a parking allowance. The details of the disclosure had been withheld from the chief executive specifically because the chief executive was the party capable of creating the conflict. Diane sat very still. I didn't win that room by ambushing her. I won it because 11 days before there was any money on the table, I'd written down the one fact that could have gotten me disqualified, handed it to the people with authority to disqualify me, and let them decide. Then I presented, and it took 19 minutes, and it wasn't dramatic. I'd found an error in the thermal control logic governing a secondary bleed path, a fault that appears in roughly one duty cycle out of 4,000 under a narrow combination of altitude, ambient temperature, and power draw. On a test rig, it looks like nothing. It looks like noise. But the path sits on a structure that's bonded, not bolted, and bonded structure can't be revised after tooling without redesigning everything around it. Which means that if this had surfaced in year 3 of production instead of that morning, the company would be looking at a recall of every airframe delivered and a 2-year redesign of the center section. Daniel Ford, the engineering director, said quietly from the middle of the table that his team had flagged the same region 11 months earlier and had been directed to keep to schedule. Nobody asked who had given that direction. I watched Diane's face when the room went silent, and I knew exactly which sentence was running behind her eyes, because it had been said to her in the dark on a wet road 14 hours earlier by a man she thought fixed things for a living. Sometimes one bolt is the thing that stops the entire company. Robert asked the only question that mattered, whether there was a fix that didn't cost 2 years. I told him yes, that a workable architecture already existed, had existed for 10 years, and had been developed inside that building by an engineer who no longer worked there. Then I said her name, Claire Whitfield. 11 years earlier, Claire had proposed a different approach to thermal protection on a smaller program, an architecture with redundant passive margin instead of tighter active control, arguing it would cost 8 months up front and save a decade of exposure. The company went the other way. I knew precisely why, and so did the woman at the head of that table, because Diane had been the one to reject it, writing 2 words in the margin of the review that Daniel Ford had kept a copy of for 11 years, too conservative. Claire was 29. She was the chief executive's daughter, and every engineer in that building assumed she'd been overruled for the second reason rather than the first, which is its own
kind of damage. She left the company 14 months later. She didn't stop working on it. That's the part I'd want anyone to understand about my wife. She kept developing that architecture at a kitchen table in a rented house. And I did the reliability modeling because that's what I'm good at, and she did the physics because she was better than me at that. It was never revenge. She believed the design was better and wanted it to exist in the world whether or not anyone ever put her name on it. She used to say a good idea doesn't care who's holding it. We filed jointly, 4 patents, 2 continuations, all clean, all documented, all hers as much as mine. When Claire died, her half of it didn't come to me. It went into a trust established while she was still well enough to sign her name clearly, with one beneficiary, Maya Marsh, age 7, in a 2nd grade classroom 90 miles away, drawing a picture of a horse. So here was the position the room found itself in. The only architecture that could save the company's largest program in under 2 years couldn't be licensed without the agreement of 2 parties, myself and a trust belonging to the granddaughter Diane Whitfield had learned about the night before. She fought it,
Of course she fought it. And she fought it the only way she'd ever been taught, by making an offer. Right there in front of the board, she proposed an executive vice presidency for me, with a technical division of my own choosing, a consulting agreement at 4 times my current rate, options vesting over 5 years, a fully funded education trust for Maya through graduate school, and a buyout of the intellectual property outright at a number she named without consulting her CFO, because she'd already decided everything in that room was purchasable and had only been mispriced. I declined to combine my family with a transaction and said it in those words. Diane's control broke for the first time in public, and her voice came up. She told the table I was holding her company hostage. I said no. I said I was asking her company to repair the thing her own engineers had warned her about 11 months ago and been told to work around. Robert Keene, who'd said almost nothing for an hour, said the board would be following the technical process, and the way he said process closed the subject. Then I gave them the part nobody was expecting, the reason I'd come at all. I told them I'd license the architecture non-exclusively at a rate I'd put in writing that afternoon. Fair market, third-party comparable, no premium for leverage, no penalty for history. I wasn't there to break Whitfield Aerospace. 11,000 people worked there, and 4 of them personally called me after Claire died, and one of them still sends my daughter a birthday card. I had one condition, and it wasn't financial. An independent review, conducted by people the executive suite didn't select, into the pattern of engineering warnings that had been overridden for schedule on this program and the 2 before it. I didn't want her money. I have never wanted her money, and I understand this was the single hardest thing about me for her to metabolize. She had a category for men who wanted money, and a category for men who pretended not to want money, and she didn't have a third one. What I wanted was for the system to change, so the next 29-year-old engineer who is right in that building doesn't have to leave it to find out.
Every measurement Diane had taken of me in that truck, every conclusion, every kind and awful assumption about a man with a lunchbox behind his seat came apart in the space of 1 sentence. Before I picked up my folder and left the room, I said the last thing I'd brought with me. Something Claire told me once at that kitchen table. She said her mother would only ever learn the value of a thing after it stopped being for sale. That night, Diane read every letter. She told me later it took her until nearly 4 in the morning. Claire married, Claire pregnant, then Claire a mother, with a name and a weight and a date. Claire describing a small house with a bad roof and a good kitchen, the mortgage, how proud she was of it. Claire enclosing the address plainly twice at the bottom of the page, like an invitation left on a table. Then the later ones. Claire asking her mother to call 1 time for any reason, any day, and saying she wouldn't ask again. Claire saying she was sick in 1 paragraph, without drama. And the last one, in that thin, slow handwriting in which my wife told her mother she was no longer waiting for an apology and had stopped expecting one, and that the only thing she still hoped for was that someday, if Diane ever met the girl, she wouldn't treat Maya the way she'd treated the man Maya's mother chose. That letter had been sitting in a gray box on a lower level, 11 feet below a kitchen where Diane ate breakfast every morning for 2.5 years. And here's the blow that actually landed, the one Diane said out loud to me later with no defense in front of it at all. Nobody had hidden Claire from her. The address was in the box. The company had a security department that could locate a person in an afternoon. She could have found her daughter on any one of 2,900 days. She simply never looked. She came to my house that Saturday. No company car, no assistant, no driver waiting at the curb. Just a rental sedan parked crooked at the bottom of my driveway, and a woman in flat shoes who had clearly not chosen flat shoes in years. I didn't invite her in. Maya was at a birthday party 4 streets over and would be back at 2, and I told Diane that, and told her whether she was still standing in my yard at 2 was going to depend entirely on the next 15 minutes. She nodded. Then she began,
and within 1 minute I knew the letters had cracked her but hadn't yet changed her. She talked about a private school 40 minutes from my house. She talked about a trust structure her attorneys could establish by Wednesday. She talked about a better house in a better district, and she was building the whole thing at speed the way she'd built the offer in the boardroom. She genuinely believed she was being generous. I let her finish. Then I said the only thing that was going to get through, quietly, standing on my own steps with my hands in my pockets. You are bidding again. She didn't understand. She actually didn't, and that was somehow the saddest part of the whole morning. So I made it plain. I told her she had once tried to buy Claire away from me with a house and a name and a life, and when the price failed, she withdrew the offer and called it a decision. And now she was standing in my driveway trying to buy her way into my daughter's life with tuition and a trust, because it was the only language she'd ever bothered to become fluent in. She started to answer, then stopped, her hand coming to her mouth, and she stood in my yard for a while looking at the hedge like it had said something to her.
So I set the terms. Diane does not get access to Maya on the basis of blood, because blood is not a credential, and my daughter is not a Wickfield asset waiting to be recovered. She does not get to appear in that child's life as a rescue. If a day ever comes that Maya meets her, it will be because Diane has demonstrated over a length of time that she doesn't get to choose, that she's capable of entering another person's life without attempting to run it. Diane Whitfield, who had a prepared answer for everything, stood in front of me with nothing at all. She said, "All right." 2 words, no counteroffer. I believe that was the first honest negotiation of her life. Before she left, I went inside and came back out with the rabbit. I hadn't planned it. Maya had left it on the arm of the couch that morning because a birthday party is a place you bring a rabbit to lose. I held it out, and Diane raised her hand toward it, then stopped exactly the way she had on the floor of my truck, 4 inches short. Then she asked me a question that itself was the whole story of the change beginning. She said, "May I hold it?" I said yes. She took it in both hands, turned it over, found the ear with her thumb, 6 uneven stitches in red thread that she'd put there on a hallway floor 25 years earlier for a crying girl who grew up to be an engineer and a wife and a mother, and then a name on a stone. She didn't cry the way people cry in films. Her face barely moved. She held that rabbit for about 30 seconds, and I watched a woman understand that for 8 years the thing closest to her daughter had been a piece of stuffed fabric she'd repaired badly and then forgotten. Then she handed it back, thanked me, and drove away, asking for nothing else. The board reconvened 11 days later, and the mood in the building was ugly because delay is a word that costs people bonuses. 3 members had spent the week arguing the finding was marginal, the exposure theoretical, that the company should proceed to tooling and address the thermal path in a later production block. 2 wanted Diane to push it through on her authority, and she had that authority, and everyone in the room knew the arithmetic favored her if she used it. I sat at the far end again with my folder, prepared to lose. Diane stood up, and then she did the thing I didn't see coming. She told the board the engineers had warned her. She said it without cushioning, that she had prioritized an announcement window over an engineering process, and that this had happened more than once. She recommended the delay herself on the record and asked that her recommendation be minuted in those words. Then she made one further request that stopped the room. She asked that the design the company was about to license be credited in the engineering record under the name of its author in full as Claire Whitfield Marsh, not Claire Whitfield. She was specific about it, and I understood exactly what she was giving up, because for a woman like her, that hyphenated name was a public admission that her daughter had married a man she refused to meet and had died carrying his name.
She could have kept the family line clean. Instead, she put my wife's whole name into a technical archive that will outlast everyone at that table. Then she signed the licensing agreement at the ordinary rate I'd proposed, with no family provision attached, no visitation language, no mention of a trust beneficiary or a school.
A granddaughter. Clean commercial paper. I read every line twice, looking for the hook. There was no hook. The board did the rest. They chartered an independent technical committee with authority to halt any program milestone on safety grounds, reporting to the board. Diane kept her title, her office, her salary. What she lost was the thing she'd actually been protecting for 11 years, the ability to override a safety judgment by herself in a hallway in 4 seconds, the way she'd once ordered a daughter's letters into a basement. Nobody fired her. There was no walk to the elevator with a box, no speech, no security escort, because real consequences are almost never theatrical. She simply came to work the following Monday as the chief executive whose word was no longer final on the only subject that had ever really mattered. She caught up with me in the corridor outside the boardroom afterward. She didn't ask to meet Maya. She didn't ask when she'd be forgiven, or whether she would be, or what she could do to accelerate it. The absence of those questions told me more than any speech could have. She said 5 words: "You were right about me." I told her Claire had been right about her too, and that she'd refused to listen. Then I said goodbye and walked to the parking garage, because there was nothing else true left to say, and I've never seen the point of saying anything else. 4 months later, the program went back into flight test with the new thermal architecture, 8 months behind the original schedule and considerably harder to break. I'm still the independent assessor. I turned down the vice presidency twice in writing and turned down the consulting rate as well, because the value of what I do collapses the moment I start being paid by the people I'm checking. My daughter still goes to the same school in the same district, and the roof on our house is still bad. And in that time, Diane Whitfield did exactly one thing over and over without being told to. She wrote letters to Maya, addressed to my house, roughly 1 every 2 weeks, and not one of them contained a check, a gift card, a toy, a brochure, or an invitation. She wrote about weather, and about a dog she had as a girl, and about a plane she ever flew in, and about a woman named Claire who once took a clock apart at 11 years old and got it back together with 2 pieces left over. She never once asked to visit. I read every letter before Maya saw any of them, then kept them in a drawer in the kitchen and told my daughter they were there, that they were hers, that she could read them or not read them or burn them in the yard, and that nobody in the world would be angry at her either way. It took 9 months. Then one evening she asked me what a grandmother was supposed to be like. I told her the truth, that nobody knows, and that people have to show you. They met on a Saturday in October at a small place beside the lake, with 6 tables and a window that fogs. Diane got there first, which I noticed, and came alone, which I noticed more. No assistant, no driver, no car with a company plate parked at the door. She'd left the rental in the public lot up the hill and walked down in a plain coat. Maya and I arrived 11 minutes late because we'd had a debate in the parking lot about whether the rabbit was coming, and the rabbit won. I didn't coach my daughter, didn't tell her what to call anyone, didn't tell her what had happened in a truck on a mountain road 2 years earlier, because that's a story for someone older than 8. Maya carried the rabbit in the crook of her elbow, the way she's carried it since she was 5, and Diane looked at the rabbit before she looked at the child, and I watched her make herself stop doing that. We sat down. There was a long moment where nobody had anything.
Then my daughter, who is not shy and never has been, put the rabbit on the table between them and asked the question she'd apparently been saving for 9 months. Was Diane the one who sewed the ear? Diane looked at the 6 uneven stitches in red thread, more than 30 years old now, gone gray with washing. She said, "Yes." Maya turned the ear over, examined it with the terrible fairness of a second grader, and delivered her verdict that Diane had sewn it badly. I laughed before I could stop myself. Then Diane Whitfield laughed too, out loud, shoulders down, hand over her eyes, in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with being anybody's chief executive. Nothing was forgiven at that table. My daughter didn't call her grandmother that day, or for a long while after, and Diane didn't ask her to. There was no reunion, no speech, because the past doesn't dissolve, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. 3 people ordered food beside a lake in October and talked about a horse Maya isn't allowed to have. And on the empty chair between Diane and me sat an old cream-colored rabbit with one green button eye, the same rabbit that had rolled out from under the back seat of a truck she once thought belonged to a man beneath her notice. Diane once believed power meant never having to ask anyone's permission, but on the day my daughter set that rabbit down in her hands and told her the stitching was crooked, she finally understood that the things most worth keeping in this life never belong to the people who take them. They belong to the ones patient enough to be handed them.